The morning mist hung heavy over Windsor Castle as Sergeant Marcus Thompson adjusted his crimson uniform for what he believed would be another routine day protecting the royal family. 23 years of dedicated service had taught him to expect the unexpected, but nothing could have prepared him for the events that would unfold on this particular Tuesday in October. Marcus had been assigned to Prince George's personal security detail for the past 4 years, watching the young prince grow from a curious 8-year-old into a thoughtful 12-year-old who possessed an unusual awareness of the world around him. Unlike many children his age, Prince George seemed to understand the weight of his future responsibilities, often asking questions that surprised even the most seasoned palace staff. The day began like any other. Marcus stood at his designated position outside the prince's private study, where George was receiving his morning tutoring session. The sound of mathematics equations and historical dates drifted through the ornate wooden door, mixed with the patient voice of Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, the prince's longtime tutor. What Marcus didn't know was that Prince George had been observing him for months, noticing things that others missed. The prince had watched how Marcus's hands trembled slightly during certain ceremonies, how he sometimes paused to catch his breath after climbing stairs, and how he occasionally winced when standing for long periods. These were subtle signs that spoke of a deeper struggle, one that Marcus had been hiding from everyone, including his superiors. During a brief break between lessons, Prince George stepped out of his study and approached Marcus with an unusual request. Instead of asking about security procedures or sharing an interesting fact he'd learned, as he often did, the prince asked Marcus to sit down for a moment. This simple request caught the experienced guard completely off guard. Marcus politely declined, explaining that protocol required him to remain standing while on duty, but Prince George persisted with a gentle insistence that was both mature beyond his years and surprisingly commanding. There was something in the young prince's eyes that made Marcus pause, something that suggested this wasn't just a casual conversation. The prince began talking about his recent studies on military history, specifically focusing on the stories of soldiers who had served their country with honor but had faced challenges that weren't immediately visible to others. As he spoke, Marcus realized that this 12-year-old boy was trying to tell him something important without directly confronting him. Prince George mentioned how he had learned about post-traumatic stress disorder in his modern history lessons, how soldiers returning from conflicts sometimes carried invisible wounds that were just as real and significant as physical injuries. The prince spoke with such understanding and compassion that Marcus found himself truly listening, perhaps for the first time in years, to someone who seemed to genuinely care about his well-being. The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes, with Prince George sharing stories of historical figures who had shown courage not just in battle, but in acknowledging when they needed help. He spoke of how true bravery sometimes meant stepping back from duty to heal, rather than pushing forward and potentially causing harm to oneself or others. Marcus began to feel an unexpected emotion rising in his chest. For the first time since returning from his deployment in Afghanistan 5 years earlier, someone was acknowledging the struggle he had been facing, the nightmares that woke him at 3 in the morning, the hypervigilance that made him constantly scan for threats even in the safety of the palace, the exhaustion that came from being perpetually alert. As their conversation drew to a close, Prince George made a statement that would change everything. He quietly told Marcus that he had noticed his dedication and service, but he was also concerned about his well-being. The prince said that while he felt completely safe under Marcus's protection, he believed that Marcus deserved to take care of himself the same way he took care of others. The young prince then did something that surprised everyone within earshot. He asked Marcus if he would consider speaking with someone who could help him with the challenges he was facing, not as an order from a member of the royal family, but as a request from someone who genuinely cared about his welfare. Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes, something that hadn't happened in years of maintaining his professional composure. This child, this future king, had seen through his carefully constructed facade and had chosen to address it with kindness rather than judgment. The moment felt surreal, standing in the opulent hallway of Windsor Castle, having the most honest conversation of his adult life with a 12-year-old prince. The weight of years of suppressed emotions and unaddressed trauma suddenly felt manageable, not because the problems had disappeared, but because someone had finally acknowledged their existence. Marcus realized that he had been so focused on protecting others that he had forgotten to protect himself. That afternoon, Marcus made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. He requested a private meeting with his commanding officer to discuss his mental health and his need for professional support. The conversation with Prince George had given him the courage to take the first step toward healing. Word of Marcus's decision to seek help spread through the appropriate channels, not as gossip, but as necessary information for ensuring the continuity of royal protection services. What surprised everyone was how the decision had come about, and the role that Prince George had played in encouraging it. The royal family's private secretary was informed of the situation, as was standard protocol when any member of the security detail requested leave for medical reasons. However, what made this case unique was the mature and compassionate way Prince George had handled the situation, demonstrating wisdom and empathy that impressed even the most experienced palace staff. As the day ended, Marcus stood at his post one final time before beginning his temporary leave. Prince George appeared in the hallway, not to say goodbye, but to remind Marcus that seeking help was not a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength and self-respect. The prince thanked Marcus for his years of dedicated service and assured him that his job would be waiting when he was ready to return. The evening news that night carried no mention of the day's events, as palace business was conducted with the utmost discretion. But within the walls of Windsor Castle, a quiet transformation had begun, sparked by the wisdom and compassion of a young prince who understood that true leadership sometimes meant helping others help themselves. Marcus left the castle that evening with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years, knowing that tomorrow would bring the beginning of his journey toward healing, supported by the unexpected understanding of a future king who had seen his struggle and chosen to respond with kindness rather than indifference. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus Thompson had walked through the gates of Windsor Castle, and the absence of the familiar guard had not gone unnoticed by Prince George. While Corporal Jennifer Hayes had seamlessly stepped into the role of personal protection officer, the prince found himself thinking about Marcus and wondering how he was progressing with his treatment. During this time, Prince George had been conducting his own quiet research into military mental health services, using his privileged access to information and his natural curiosity to better understand what Marcus might be experiencing. The prince had discovered that many veterans struggled with the transition from military to civilian life, and that the symptoms Marcus had displayed were more common than he had initially realized. What impressed the palace staff was how Prince George had handled the situation with such discretion and maturity. He had not spoken about Marcus's condition to anyone outside the necessary official channels, understanding instinctively that mental health struggles deserved privacy and respect. This showed a level of emotional intelligence that surprised even his experienced tutors and advisors. Mrs. Hartwell had noticed a change in Prince George's studies during this period. He had become particularly interested in leadership styles that emphasized empathy and emotional intelligence, asking detailed questions about historical leaders who had shown compassion for their followers. His essays had begun focusing on themes of servant leadership and the responsibility of those in power to care for those who served them. Meanwhile, Marcus was attending daily counseling sessions at a specialized clinic for military personnel, working with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a therapist who specialized in post-traumatic stress disorder. The first week had been the most difficult, as Marcus had to confront emotions and memories he had been suppressing for years. The nightmares had actually intensified initially, but Dr. Mitchell assured him this was a normal part of the healing process. During one particularly challenging session, Marcus found himself talking about Prince George and the conversation that had led to his decision to seek help. Dr. Mitchell was struck by the way Marcus described the young prince's approach, noting that it demonstrated remarkable emotional maturity and genuine concern for others' well-being. Dr. Mitchell explained to Marcus that what Prince George had done was an example of compassionate leadership, recognizing that true authority comes from caring for those under your protection, not just commanding them. This insight helped Marcus understand why the conversation had been so powerful and why it had motivated him to take action. Back at the castle, Prince George had been working with his private secretary to arrange something unprecedented. He wanted to send a personal note to Marcus, but palace protocol required careful consideration of such communications. After several discussions with senior staff and approval from his parents, the prince was allowed to send a brief formal letter expressing his support for Marcus's recovery. The letter was delivered to Marcus during his 3rd week of treatment, arriving at a moment when he was struggling with feelings of shame and uncertainty about his future. The elegant royal stationery contained a handwritten note from Prince George, expressing his continued respect for Marcus's service and his admiration for the courage Marcus was showing in addressing his challenges. The letter also contained something unexpected, an invitation for Marcus to visit the castle when he felt ready, not as a guard returning to duty, but as someone the prince would like to speak with about his recovery journey. This gesture moved Marcus deeply, as it showed that Prince George viewed him as more than just an employee, but as a person worthy of ongoing concern and friendship. Dr. Mitchell encouraged Marcus to accept the invitation when he felt emotionally prepared, explaining that having supportive relationships was crucial for long-term recovery. She noted that Prince George's continued interest in Marcus's well-being was unusual and valuable, representing the kind of understanding and acceptance that could aid in healing. As Marcus's treatment progressed, he began to understand the impact that his unaddressed trauma had been having, not just on himself, but potentially on his ability to protect others effectively. The hypervigilance and anxiety that he had mistaken for heightened awareness had actually been symptoms that could have compromised his judgment in a crisis situation. This realization was both sobering and liberating. Sobering because it meant acknowledging that his condition could have put the royal family at risk, but liberating because it confirmed that seeking treatment was not just beneficial for himself, but necessary for fulfilling his professional responsibilities effectively. During his 4th week of treatment, Marcus made significant progress in processing his experiences from Afghanistan. He had been part of a peacekeeping mission that had gone tragically wrong, resulting in the loss of 3 fellow soldiers under his command. The guilt and responsibility he felt for their deaths had been eating away at him for years, affecting every aspect of his life. Dr. Mitchell helped Marcus understand that survivor's guilt was a common response to traumatic military experiences and that carrying this burden alone had been damaging his mental health. Through specialized therapy techniques, Marcus began to develop healthier ways of processing these memories and emotions. Around this same time, news reached the palace that Marcus was making excellent progress in his treatment and was beginning to consider his options for returning to work. However, both Marcus and his therapist agreed that he would benefit from a different role, one that didn't involve the constant high-alert status required for royal protection duties. Prince George, upon learning about Marcus's progress, suggested something that surprised the palace staff. He proposed that Marcus might be well suited for a role in veteran outreach programs, using his experience and recovery journey to help other military personnel who might be struggling with similar challenges. The prince had researched various programs and believed that Marcus's combination of military experience and personal growth could make him an effective advocate for mental health awareness. This suggestion demonstrated Prince George's continued thoughtfulness about Marcus's situation and his understanding that recovery often involves finding new purpose and meaning. The prince had recognized that Marcus's experience, while painful, had given him valuable insights that could benefit others facing similar struggles. The palace began exploring possibilities for Marcus to work with military charities and veteran support organizations, roles that would utilize his skills and experience while allowing him to maintain better work-life balance and continue his therapeutic progress. As the 5th week of treatment concluded, Marcus felt ready to accept Prince George's invitation to visit the castle. He had made significant progress in managing his symptoms and had developed coping strategies that would help him navigate challenging situations in the future. The upcoming meeting would mark a new chapter in both Marcus's recovery and in his relationship with the young prince who had shown such unexpected wisdom and compassion. Both looked forward to the conversation, knowing it would be different from their previous interactions, built on mutual respect and a shared understanding of the importance of mental health and emotional well-being. The November afternoon was crisp and clear when Marcus Thompson walked through the familiar gates of Windsor Castle, but this time his visit carried a completely different meaning. 6 weeks of intensive therapy had transformed not just his mental state, but his entire perspective on life, service, and what it meant to truly protect and serve others. Prince George was waiting in the same study where their transformative conversation had taken place weeks earlier. However, instead of standing at attention outside the door, Marcus was invited to sit across from the prince in comfortable armchairs beside a warm fireplace. The setting felt more like a meeting between friends than between a royal and a former employee. The change in Marcus was immediately apparent to Prince George. The tension that had been visible in his shoulders and jaw had eased, and his eyes held a clarity and peace that hadn't been there during his years of service. Dr. Mitchell's treatment program had been remarkably successful. But more importantly, Marcus had done the difficult work of confronting his trauma and developing healthy coping mechanisms. Prince George began the conversation by asking about Marcus's recovery journey, showing genuine interest in understanding what the healing process had involved. Marcus found himself sharing details about his therapy sessions, the challenges he had faced, and the insights he had gained about himself and his experiences in Afghanistan. What struck Prince George most powerfully was Marcus's description of how acknowledging his struggles had actually made him stronger and more self-aware. The prince listened intently as Marcus explained that suppressing his trauma had required enormous energy that was now available for more positive purposes. This conversation deepened Prince George's understanding of mental health and the courage required to seek help. Marcus then shared the news that had brought him particular joy during his recovery. He had accepted a position with a veteran support organization that provided counseling and assistance to military personnel transitioning to civilian life. His role would involve using his own experience to help other veterans recognize the signs of mental health struggles and encourage them to seek appropriate treatment. Prince George expressed his admiration for Marcus's new direction, recognizing that this career change represented a different but equally important form of service. The prince understood that Marcus would now be protecting people in a different way, helping to save lives through mental health advocacy rather than physical security. During their conversation, Marcus revealed something that surprised Prince George. He explained that the prince's intervention had not only saved his career and possibly his life, but had also inspired him to become an advocate for mental health awareness within military and security communities. Marcus had realized that many of his fellow veterans were struggling in silence, just as he had been. The impact of their original conversation had rippled outward in ways that Prince George had never anticipated. Marcus had already begun speaking with other palace security personnel about mental health resources, breaking down the stigma that often prevented military personnel from seeking help. Several guards had approached him for advice, and two had begun their own therapy programs. Prince George listened with growing amazement as Marcus described how their brief conversation had sparked a broader movement within the royal protection services. The palace administration had implemented new policies for supporting staff mental health, including regular check-ins and readily available counseling services. Marcus then shared something that moved Prince George deeply. He explained that during his therapy sessions, he had come to understand that the prince's intervention represented a perfect example of compassionate leadership. Dr. Mitchell had used their interaction as a case study for how people in positions of authority could create safe spaces for others to acknowledge their vulnerabilities. The conversation then took on a more forward-looking tone as they discussed Prince George's future role as a leader. Marcus offered insights from his military experience about the importance of leaders who prioritize the well-being of those they serve. He explained that the most effective commanders were those who understood that taking care of their people was essential for mission success. Prince George asked Marcus for advice about how he could continue to develop this kind of leadership style as he grew older and took on more responsibilities. Marcus suggested that the prince's natural empathy and observation skills were already excellent foundations, but that continuing to educate himself about mental health and social issues would make him an even more effective leader. They spent considerable time discussing the broader implications of mental health awareness in public service roles. Marcus explained how the culture of silence around psychological struggles had prevented many capable people from getting help they needed, sometimes resulting in tragedy. Prince George expressed his commitment to using his platform to help change these attitudes when he was older. As their meeting drew to a close, Marcus presented Prince George with something unexpected: a letter from Dr. Mitchell expressing her gratitude for the prince's intervention. The therapist had written to explain how rare it was to see such mature emotional intelligence in someone so young, and how Marcus's case had become an inspiration in her practice. Dr. Mitchell's letter also contained a request. She asked if Prince George might consider supporting mental health initiatives for veterans and public servants when he was in a position to do so. The letter explained that having royal patronage for such causes could significantly reduce stigma and encourage more people to seek help. Prince George accepted this challenge with enthusiasm, already beginning to envision how he might incorporate mental health advocacy into his future royal duties. The conversation with Marcus had shown him that true leadership involved recognizing and responding to the needs of others, even when those needs weren't explicitly expressed. Before Marcus left, he and Prince George established an informal agreement to stay in touch about their respective journeys. Marcus would continue his work in veteran support services, while Prince George would focus on developing his leadership skills and learning more about social issues affecting the communities he would one day serve. The impact of their relationship extended beyond their personal growth. Palace staff had noticed positive changes in the overall culture around mental health and employee well-being. Prince George's example had encouraged other members of the royal family to take a more active interest in staff welfare, leading to improved support systems throughout the royal household. As Marcus prepared to leave Windsor Castle that day, both he and Prince George understood that their interaction had created something larger than either of them had initially imagined. What had begun as a moment of compassionate observation by a young prince had evolved into a catalyst for meaningful change in how mental health was addressed within royal service. The story of their relationship would remain largely private, as befitted palace protocol, but its effects would be felt for years to come. Marcus would go on to help dozens of veterans find the support they needed, while Prince George would carry the lessons of their friendship into his future role as a leader and advocate for social causes. Their final exchange that November afternoon was simple but profound. Prince George thanked Marcus for his service, both past and future, while Marcus thanked the prince for seeing him as a complete person rather than just a uniform. They both understood that this moment represented not an ending, but the beginning of their parallel journeys toward serving others through empathy, understanding, and genuine care for human well-being. The quiet revolution they had started would continue to grow, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways that would extend far beyond the walls of Windsor Castle, proving that sometimes the most powerful changes begin with a single moment of human connection and compassion.